Alright, so today we are testing AMD's AFMF frame generation at a driver level in 8 games, depending on how many games actually work, but I've got 8 games planned. Just a few things that I need to go over here with you. So this is the latest driver, the one that launched on the 13th of October, and that actually enabled AFMF for any DX11 and 12 title, right? Then currently, it is also supported on all RX 7000 and 6000 series GPUs. And then just the one or two things that we need to talk over here. We need to use anti-lag, obviously, because it does increase the latency slightly. Then we need to have the game played in full screen mode with VSync disabled. And then it is recommended to have it played on AMD FreeSync displays, right? So no VSync enabled, VRR enabled, full screen. And then for a minimum FPS at 1080p, we are looking at 55 frames per second, and then anything higher than that, 1440p and above, we're looking at a minimum 70 frames per second before we toggle AFMF. Then for the games tested today, we'll be testing at 1080p on an RX 7600, and I'll be aiming for 60 frames per second without AFMF as recommended here, 55 frames per second. So I'll adjust the settings accordingly so that I get around 60 frames per second. Then I'll enable AFMF and we'll see what the results are. Alright, so the first game we'll be testing is Cyberpunk 2077. We're at 1080p at the moment. This is actually on the Ultra preset. I just disabled film grain, all these post-processing effects because they just look stupid. And we've got no ray tracing enabled yet either, and no upscaling. Right, so there's going to be 2 performance metrics shown here. Let me just get all of them up. Right, so you'll have one on the top right hand corner there, which is the AMD overlay, and the top left hand corner is MSI Afterburner. So AFMF does not work with third-party capturing utilities at the moment, or performance metric utilities. So the moment we enable AFMF, the frame rate on the left hand side will not increase, but I'm going to leave it open because that'll just give us our base frame rate basically without AFMF. And then in the top right hand corner, you'll see our frame rate with AFMF. So at the moment we are getting around 70 frames per second, between 70 and 80. This is a pretty demanding area, and the GPU is definitely not doing too badly here at 1080p on the Ultra preset. So I'm just going to do a quick run just to see what kind of numbers we're getting, just to make sure we stay above 60 frames per second at all times. Spoiler alert, we do. And now we'll just toggle AFMF to see what the frame rates look like. Right, so to do that, we just press Alt and R, and you'll be presented with the Radeon's overlay. And over here you can just enable Fluid Motion Frames. I thought the game crashed, and now you can see frame generation status is set to active. Right, so now you can see in the top left hand corner we are sitting at 70 frames per second, but in the top right hand corner we're sitting at 140 frames per second. So definitely, well, according to the AMD overlay, it doubled our frame rate. I'm actually externally connected to 144 Hz 1080p panel, and the motion fluidity is definitely much increased. One thing though that you do need to remember about AFMF is that during fast motion or high camera movements, AFMF gets dynamically disabled to preserve image quality, because I don't know if you can see that if we move the mouse slowly, the HUD elements aren't really that great. So we do lose a lot of, especially in the crosshair there, you can see when there's a lot of tree branches and stuff, it does get lost. That's just the AFMF because it works on a driver level. It's not aware of UI elements. But if you want a little bit of a more in-depth analysis, then maybe just check out hardware unboxed analysis on AFMF. Definitely more in-depth than what this video will be about. This video will purely focus on performance, right? So just to show you what I mean, so we're getting 140 frames per second. Don't get dizzy now, but if you move the mouse quite a bit, you'll see that drop down to 74 frames per second in the top right hand corner, right? So that's basically AFMF getting disabled during high motion. Now you might argue that it's kind of pointless then, because we are playing a first person shooter. But if your base frame rate is high enough like we are seeing here, we can actually turn quite a bit without the frame rate dropping too much. So even in extremely high combat scenarios, I've tested it, it doesn't drop that often. It used to, but with the new driver, it's definitely much better. Driving is also not an issue. So let me just show you if there's a lot of combat on the screen here. Just have a look at the frame rate in the top right hand corner there. It does dip below 120 even at times, but very rarely have I seen that AFMF gets disabled completely. And I mean, it's a single player game, so you're not going to be too concerned about the frame rate dropping during high camera movement, just as long as it's not jarring, right? You don't want to suddenly feel your PC slow down a lot and your input latency increasing. So, I mean, that's the only drawback, but as you can see, the frame rate stays pretty stable during this fight scene so far. Alright, before I die, let's move on to the next one. Alright, so next up we've got Lords of the Fallen. Let's just go over the settings here quickly. We are still at 1080p. I don't have any FSR enabled here, and we're on the medium preset just with some post-processing effects disabled here. Now, Lords of the Fallen is actually a perfect game for FSR 3 or AFMF. Don't get the two confused. I'm only mentioning FSR 3 because initially this game was probably supposed to support FSR 3 because some streams with the pre-release version actually showed FSR 3 available in the options. It also had DLSS 3 frame generation at start, at launch, and that has been taken away because it caused some crashes apparently, but there's a way you can manually enable it. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. What I want to say is that if a game does support FSR 3, then rather use that than AFMF, purely because it's a game implemented, so it is aware of the UI elements, right? With AFMF, it's not aware of the UI elements, and FSR3 also does not dynamically disable when there's a lot of movement. All right, so we're getting around 78 frames per second here. I did see it drop below 70 at times, so this is why I'm going in these settings. As we said, this is on the medium settings, right? So I just auto set it. And let's see if AFMF actually helps in this game as well without it crashing. And as you can see, we're getting once again double the frame rate. The input latency is definitely not that bad. I don't really feel a big increase here. If we could actually monitor it, we might be able to see if there is actually a difference. But unfortunately, my channel is not making enough money yet to actually buy an LDAT, and I'm going to die here. I can't remember which is which because I play with the controller. Anyway, so even during combat scenes here, again, we are staying above 120 frames per second. Now, for those of you who wonder what frame generation is for, or who frame generation is for, I should say, it's for people with high refresh rate monitors. It's not there to get you from 30 FPS to 60 FPS. If your final frames per second output is 60 frames per second with frame generation enabled, you're going to have a terrible time. Input latency is just horrendous, and trust me, that's where a lot of hate for frame generation actually comes from. Not the only hate, but most of the hate that I've seen online. So if you do have a 60 Hz monitor, then AFMF or FSR3 or DLSS 3 frame generation is definitely not for you. Alright, so in Lords of the Fallen, we also pretty much doubled our frame rate, which is pretty good, and it seems to do okay. Even UI elements doesn't seem to be completely broken, so I do think that the latest driver fixed some issues there with the UI elements. It's still not perfect, but definitely usable. But you'll have to decide for yourself whether a higher frame rate and higher motion fluidity is worth it to you when it comes to additional artifacting and slightly increased input latency. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Right, so next up we have a Spider-Man Remastered, seeing that Spider-Man is all the craze lately. Unfortunately, us PC players, we're stuck with Spider-Man Remastered and Miles Morales because Spider-Man 2 is not coming to PC just yet. It'll probably take a year or 2 or 3, depending on when Sony decides to release it. But until then, Spider-Man Remastered will have to do. Right, so we're at 1080p, as you can see here, and no upscaling. We're on the very high preset. The Spider-Man actually runs pretty well on this GPU, except when you enable ray traced reflections. It still plays okay when you enable ray traced reflections, but the frame rate drops considerably in certain areas. So for consistency, we'll just leave ray tracing off. These are all the settings here, except I'm just going to disable all these again because I honestly don't know who plays with these. All right, so I think that's enough for now. So let's just go into the game here, and much better. So if you do notice some tearing in the screen here, it's just because my capture card is set to 4K 60 and we are going above 60 frames per second, right? So anyway, let's see what happens here. I do think we'll stay above 80 frames per second at all times. This game was actually pretty CPU bound when it released, especially when you had ray tracing enabled as well, and it seemed to have improved quite a bit because this is with a 12400F CPU, not the fastest CPU by all means, but definitely a pretty good pairing with this GPU. You see we dropped there into the 70s there, 70 frames per second. So this is why I'm playing at these settings, because I was able to maintain 60 frames per second or above at all times. So let's see what happens once we enable frame generation, or AFMF. All right, so it's enabled and it's active. I just always make sure that it does show that it's active. Right, and we're dropping into the 50s here. That's pretty strange. We did not see that previously, but the frame rate in the top right hand corner staying above 100 frames per second, so pretty much once again double our frame rate. So let's just see if we build up some momentum here with the swinging, whether the frame rate actually drops. I don't think it will. I don't think it's enough movement or camera movement for AFMF to dynamically disable, except there it dropped into the 80s there. So, and they're into the 70s. It's still higher than our frame rate in the top left hand corner. So there does seem to be some overhead, right? We are dropping below 60 more often than not. We were maintaining 60 in the top left hand corner, our base frame rate. We were maintaining 60 at all times, but now we're dipping below 60 with AFMF enabled. So there does seem to be some overhead. I mean, in this specific area, we're getting 60, it's dipping into the mid 50s there, so which is kind of strange. I did not see that previously without AFMF enabled. But in the top right hand corner, we are getting between 90 and 120 frames per second. So if you do have a 120 hertz monitor, 144 hertz monitor, you can definitely get the motion fluidity of a high refresh rate monitor. Kind of strange that it does have this big a performance impact with AFMF enabled, but I mean, this is a tech driver. It's basically alpha stage at this point, so I'm not really too concerned. We'll do a full video on it again once it fully launches next year. All right, on to the next one. All right, so next up we have Ratchet and Clank, another Insomniac game, same as Spider-Man. So let's just go over the settings here. Currently we're at 1080p on the medium preset and no upscaling or anything, right? So we are getting around 60 frames per second. So I'd say the circumstances are ripe for us to enable AFMF. I'm just going to fight one or two monsters here. What I did notice is there's no monsters here. You can just see the... because I already fought them. You can see the frame time graph there. It's very inconsistent. There's a lot of stuttering going on here, and I did notice this after the latest AMD driver update. I mean, this is a tech driver update, so it's not fully certified, so that will make sense. But with the previous AFMF driver, the game didn't stutter as much. So I mean, this is just how it goes with the driver update. Sometimes you fix one thing, you accidentally break another thing, but the stuttering is kind of annoying. But anyway, so we're getting around 70 frames per second here. Let's see what happens once we enable AFMF. Right, so AFMF is active here. I keep on pressing escape there. And once again, our frame rate dropped below 50 there, our base frame rate in the top left hand corner. But in the top right hand corner, we can see we're getting double that which is reported in the top left. So the only reason why I'm testing Ratchet and Clank, see, the stuttering is still there. This game does have a lot of fast movement, and you can just see the frame generation being disabled, right? So dropping into the 60s, into the 50s there. So for this game, I'd say maybe it's best to wait for official AFMF implementation, because the frame rate will definitely drop more than other games we've tested so far. As you can see, dropping into the 60s there, just because there's, as I said, a lot of fast movement as a third-person shooter. But I mean, just play without frame generation on with this game, or without AFMF at least, and we'll be testing FSR3 as soon as that launches in this game. All right, I mean, you can see the stuttering there. It's just not ideal. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. Right, so next up we've got Remnant 2, and let's just go over the settings here quickly. We're at 1080p, just on the medium preset, because this is pretty much where we can maintain 60 frames per second. We have detailed shadows and detailed geometry disabled. I do have minimize input latency enabled here. I'm not sure if it actually does anything, but hey, got to enable these options. Right, so our MSI afterburner is back to its normal size, and you can see getting around 70 frames per second here. I did run this earlier and we were able to maintain 60 frames per second at all times. I mean, I think it dropped below 60 once or twice, but that was because of a stutter. This game has come a long way when it comes to performance. It was pretty terrible at launch, and upscaling was actually forced upon you. The game just ran terribly, but after a few updates the game does play a lot better, and I've actually started playing the campaign. Anyway, so we're getting around 60-70 frames per second, even into the 80s there for a few seconds. So let's see if we can actually get AFMF to work on here. I mean, we shouldn't have an issue, but you never know. All right, so AFMF is enabled, getting 75 frames per second there in the top left-hand corner and 150 frames per second in the top right-hand corner, and that's exactly what you want. If you do have a 144 hertz monitor, I mean, I'm as I said, I'm playing on one, and the motion fluidity is definitely much improved. With regards to the frame time pacing, unfortunately, I don't have a utility that can measure that with AFMF. As I said, RTSS or MSI Afterburner doesn't work with that, so I'm pretty sure hypr-rx would also not work with it. So at the moment, we're just going on a feel, but so far it's definitely doing okay. And you can see the mouse movement. Just look at the crosshair. It seems to do okay-ish. Right, unless there's a lot of background detail like these roots. If you move over them quickly, you'll see the crosshair disappear, and these support pillars, they'll also impede on your crosshair. I think it might be, so over here it's not as noticeable. Here it is again. So I think when there's a lot of depth, it actually does change. Right, so, oh no, that's just me being stupid. I can't shoot there, so it does disappear there. Anyway, let's try that again. I think it's much better than what it was at launch, AFMF at least. So definitely usable if you want to get a little bit of a higher frame rate on your high refresh rate monitor. As I said, it's not a true high refresh rate experience, but you do get the motion fluidity of a high refresh rate experience. All right, on to the next one. All right, and next up we've got The Witcher 3. This is in DX12 mode, and let's just go over the settings here quickly. Right, so we're at 1080p, no upscaling. Then on the graphics settings, we're just on the ultra preset here, and that got us around 60 frames per second here. Just above 70 frames per second actually. So let's just do my quick run. Now, just for those of you who skipped ahead, the numbers in the top left hand corner, the FPS number there is the base frame rate, and the numbers in the top right hand corner will be the correct number once we actually enable AFMF, right? I know I said it before, but some people skip ahead. So this is without AFMF, and let's see what we can do with AFMF enabled here. Right, so AFMF is active here. So once again, there is a slight performance penalty by enabling AFMF. I mean, just with the base frame rate, right? So base frame rate went down from 72 frames per second to 65, but you can see we are getting double that in the top right hand corner, 130 frames per second. Now, one thing that I didn't mention in the previous game, Remnant 2, it is a lot slower paced than Ratchet and Clank, so therefore the frame rate shouldn't drop too much. AFMF should not disable frame generation too much in that one, and it'll be pretty similar in The Witcher 3. It's also slower paced than Ratchet and Clank, so frame generation should stay on a little bit longer than in Ratchet and Clank, right? As you can see, we are panning the camera normally and there's no frame rate drop, but as the moment you start spinning quite aggressively, the frame rate does drop, right? But if you play the game normally, this should be fine. All right, so that's The Witcher 3. Let's move on to the next one. All right, so next up, we've got Starfield. Now, I know I already did a Starfield video with the RX 7600 and AFMF, but there's been a few driver updates since then, and I wanted to retest it. All right, so let's just go over the settings here quickly. We're at 1080p, just on the medium preset, no upscaling. Now, Just talking about upscaling, you can obviously enable upscaling along with AFMF or any frame generation. It'll actually work slightly better because you do have a higher base frame rate then. Alright, so getting 60 frames per second here, this is definitely a game that can benefit greatly from frame generation. I wish that FSR3 was actually available in this game, or DLSS3 frame generation, because AFMF, during our last testing, the frame rate dropped quite a bit because I mean, it's a first-person shooter moving around quite a lot, and the frame rate does drop because of that, because AFMF gets dynamically disabled, right? So let's just enable it here. Right, so frame generation status is enabled there. All right, so we're getting around 60 frames per second base and 130 frames per second after AFMF, right? And you can definitely see the motion fluidity increase, especially on a high refresh rate monitor. This is pretty good, but whether it'll stay like that, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, we are spinning around quite a bit and are making you dizzy or nauseous. You can see, I mean, it's dipping into the 90s, but it comes back quite quickly again. Now, this is one of the more demanding areas of the game. The indoor areas perform much better. Sometimes we even get more than double our frame rate when we get outside. So, I mean, this is just for me to test and not really indicative of the frame rate that you can expect through the entire game. As I said, it does increase quite a bit when we are inside. All right, so let's just see. Yeah, I am. So these security guards still don't react to gunfire. Nobody reacts to gunfire. So we actually just have to... all right, cheers, Sarah. So, I mean, you actually have to start shooting people. You actually have to shoot them before they start reacting. And, I mean, you can see our base frame rate in the top left-hand corner there is dipping below 60 frames per second. I don't have ammo anymore. I can't remember how to change... Ah, there we go. Alright, it's been a while since I last played this game, and our frame rate in the top right hand corner is staying above 120, which is pretty good. But let's see if we turn around quite quickly. I mean, 90 is not the worst, and I'm actually going to die, which interesting. And now I'm back all the way up, but now you can see inside we're getting 220 frames per second. All right, so a big difference between inside and out. I'm not going to tell you exactly where we are, just so that I don't spoil anything. All right, so with that said and done, let's move on to the next one. All right, so the last game we'll be testing is The Last of Us Part 1. See what I did there. Now let's just go over the settings here quickly. Let me get rid of that. And we're at 1080p, no upscaling whatsoever. And then, whoops, that's wrong button. And if we just go into the graphics settings here, it's just on the high preset, right? Nothing else has changed here except for some post-processing effects like film grain, etc. that I've just disabled. All right, so let's just start our frame rate counter here. As you can see, we're pretty much like on the edge of being able to enable AFMF. We're getting 55 frames per second, and according to AMD, this is pretty much what the minimum frame rate should be before enabling AFMF, right? So can I run? All right, so it's been a while since I last played this game. This is my area where I benchmark. It's a very demanding area with all the bushes and foliage, etc. And this is actually a game that can benefit greatly from frame generation, right? The DLSS3 or FSR3 would be a great addition to this game. Currently, it only supports upscaling, but let's see what happens once we enable AFMF here. All right, so AFMF is enabled and it's running, and I mean, we went from 50 frames per second in the top left-hand corner to 100 frames per second in the top right-hand corner there. And once again, this is a pretty slow-paced game, so I don't think you should have any issues with the frame rate dropping too much. Sure, AFMF will dynamically disable frame generation when there's too much movement, but as I said, this game is pretty slow-paced, so there shouldn't be too much fast movement or too many sudden camera movements, and the frame rate should stay above 100 frames per second most of the time. Well, that's what I've seen in my earlier testing before making this video. It's actually pretty good, but I mean, there's also a lot of foliage, a lot of things happening on the screen here, so it'll trigger a little bit quicker, I believe. I might be wrong. So, I mean, if we just move the camera, nobody's going to be playing like this, right? You're not going to move the camera as frequently as that. But just during normal camera movement, you can see that the frame rate does stay pretty high. All right, that's going to be the last game we'll be testing for today. It's a, why is it running backwards? This is a pretty good looking game. The performance is just slightly on the low side. I'd appreciate it if we'd be able to get 60 frames per second locked with a 7600 on the high preset at 1080p, but unfortunately we can't. But with the help of AFMF, it seems to be possible, albeit not all the time. All right, but as I said, I'm just having a look at the performance here in 8 games since the driver released. It seems to do quite okay. Once again, if you can rather enable FSR3 frame generation. Currently, there's only 2 supported games, unfortunately. But as it rolls out more, I'd expect it to replace AFMF in quite a few games. And FSR3 should probably be the better choice to use. All right, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. And as always, we hope to see you in the next one.